In the palaces of Persepolis, royal blood had a price, and it was daughters. King Xerxes believed his power came from the gods, and to prove it, he used his own children. When a princess turned 13, servants bathed her, perfumed her, and led her not to a throne, but to her father's bed. The priests called it purity. The court called it law. But history calls it what it was: a sacred crime, written into custom and sealed by fear. No record dared accuse him, but the stones of Persepolis still remember the girls who never returned. If you value truth over legend, stay. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. By the 9th year of his reign, Xerxes ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. From the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, his word was law. His image carved into mountains, his name invoked as divine. But inside the palace, past the gold columns and perfumed courtyards, power was measured not in land or tribute, but in silence. In the women's quarters, girls were raised knowing they did not belong to themselves. They were royal daughters, yes, but also royal property. One of them was Amidas, a girl of 13. Her hair was dark, braided with pearls. Her eyes were painted with kohl to look older than her age. That night, her mother, once a favored wife, painted her lips without speaking. Every movement was ritual, every breath rehearsed. When the last lamp was lit, the eunuch appeared at the door. The king summons his daughter. No one argued. No one ever did. In the logic of the Persian court, this was not horror. It was holiness. The priests had declared that royal blood must never be diluted, that divine essence must remain within the royal line. So fathers took daughters, brothers took sisters, and the empire called it devotion. It was the theology of purity, a belief that turned incest into obligation and obedience into worship. The palace scribes never recorded these nights, but the law encoded them: marriage decrees, purification rites, bloodline ledgers, all written in the same ink as tax and tribute. The empire's greatness was built on the same parchment that erased its victims. Outside, the city of Persepolis glittered under moonlight. Towers of marble, gardens of lilies, terraces filled with feasts and flutes. Inside, a door closed, and the silence became empire's secret language. For the next decade, these rituals would continue, generation after generation, shaping not only Xerxes' daughters, but the soul of Persian rule itself. Because what began as a single night of obedience became the system that defined his reign. And in that system, no one, not even a child of the king, was untouchable. Before Xerxes became the ruler who turned faith into violation, he was a prince living in the shadow of a god. His father, Darius the Great, had built an empire from nothing, a web of roads, taxes, and armies that connected 3 continents. He called himself the lawgiver, the chosen of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light and truth. But his defeat at Marathon in 490 BCE cracked that illusion of divine favor. For the Persians, a king's victories proved the gods still walked with him. A loss, even one, meant something for worse, that heaven might have turned its face away. When Darius died, the throne of Persia didn't pass peacefully. It became a contest between brothers, and between visions of power. Xerxes was not the eldest son. He won not by seniority, but by birthright through his mother, Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus the Great, founder of the empire. Her lineage made Xerxes more than a prince. It made him the living union of two divine bloodlines. That blood, the priests said, carried the breath of Ahura Mazda itself, and that belief would shape the most horrifying logic of his reign. Because if the king's blood was divine, then the king's body was law. Every act, from conquest to desire, became sacred by definition. It wasn't lust, it was ritual. And those who served him didn't question the morality of his actions. They recorded them as prophecy fulfilled. The palace became a machine built to protect that illusion. Every wall was carved with images of submission, conquered nations bringing gifts, kings towering like gods, guards frozen in eternal loyalty. To live inside those walls was to breathe hierarchy. To doubt the king's divinity was to invite annihilation. Xerxes learned early that fear could rule more effectively than affection. He watched his father's court, watched servants kneel until their foreheads bled, watched rivals vanish without trace, watched priests twist scripture to justify every decision. He learned that absolute power required an absolute story, that those who controlled the sacred could control everything else. So when Xerxes inherited the throne, he inherited not just an empire, but a theology. The idea that to disobey him was to offend God himself. That idea became the architecture of his reign. He expanded Darius's postal routes not for trade, but for surveillance. He built roads not only for soldiers, but for fear to travel faster. And he rebuilt the palace at Persepolis to mirror the heavens. The king at the center, his subjects revolving around him like planets around a sun. In the beginning, the empire believed it. They saw a young monarch who spoke softly, rewarded loyalty, and promised vengeance for his father's defeat in Greece. He was the embodiment of order, the restorer of divine balance. But divinity is a drug, and power without limits corrodes faster than any poison. Within a few years, Xerxes began to believe the myth completely. He stopped being the son of Darius and became the god of himself. To prove his divine right, he needed spectacle. He needed something the world had never seen, not just a war, but a revelation. So he commanded an invasion that would consume millions of lives and define his reign, the campaign against Greece. For 4 years, the empire turned its entire economy into a machine of glory. Gold from India, horses from Babylon, cedar from Lebanon, ships from Egypt, all flowing toward one purpose: to make Xerxes' divinity visible. Every coin minted during this period bore his image beneath the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. Every tax record began with the same phrase: "In the name of the God King." This was not administration. It was liturgy, an empire worshipping its own bureaucracy. But inside the palace, another campaign was already underway, quieter, more personal, and infinitely darker. The priests had long whispered that the purest divine essence could only be preserved through holy unions within the royal line. Darius had resisted that doctrine, fearing the scandal it might cause. Xerxes embraced it. He called it the renewal of fire, a ceremony that bound the royal blood to itself. Every time he entered the chamber of one of his daughters, he wasn't committing sin. In his mind, he was reenacting creation. The priesthood confirmed it. They wrote prayers that turned violation into purification and silence into duty. The law followed. Royal decrees were issued ensuring that the daughters of the king shall remain under his divine guardianship until they are given according to his will. It sounded like protection. It meant ownership. To the outside world, the Persian Empire was the marvel of civilization, with marble cities, canals, gardens, and order unmatched in history. But within the walls of Persepolis, that same order depended on something unspeakable. Every victory parade, every carved relief of kneeling nations was paid for by the obedience learned inside the harem, the obedience of daughters who had no voice, no name, no right to refuse. Xerxes' first campaign against Greece was an empire moving under that same logic of possession. He crossed the Hellespont not as a general, but as a god, reclaiming what he believed was his by divine inheritance. He saw no difference between conquering a city and claiming a daughter. Both were acts of proof. Both were confirmations that he alone had the right to decide who lived, who died, and who was touched by divinity. That mindset would lead him to burn Athens, slaughter thousands, and still believe himself pure. It would also lead him back to Persepolis, where defeat and humiliation would turn his religion of power inward, against his own family, his own blood, and his own sanity. Because once a man believes his body is sacred, there is nothing he won't justify. And for Xerxes, that belief would soon consume everything he ruled, beginning with his daughters. To understand Xerxes, you must understand how law became religion, and how religion became a theatre of obedience. In Persia, law wasn't simply written, it was carved into permanence. Every decree, every judgment, every punishment carried divine language. As the god wills, so the king decrees. The word crime didn't mean what it means today. It wasn't about morality. It was about hierarchy, about knowing one's place. And the first law of empire was simple. What the king desires, become order. When Xerxes took the throne, he didn't invent this doctrine. He perfected it. He turned Darius's code of governance into something darker, a system that measured loyalty through silence. The priests declared that the king's body was a reflection of Ahura Mazda's light, pure, untouchable, unquestionable, which meant that to serve his body was to serve the divine. It was theology by decree, law by desire. Within the palace, that doctrine took its purest form in the harem. The harem wasn't simply a place of pleasure, it was a legal institution. Every woman inside, wife, concubine, or daughter, had an assigned status, a registry, a recorded origin. They were documented like land and livestock, not as an insult, but as proof of administrative perfection. Even desire was bureaucratized. Each royal birth generated a ledger entry: mother, lineage, potential value. Those ledgers determined not only inheritance, but also ritual use. When a princess reached maturity, her file passed from the matron of the women's quarters to the palace priesthood, a symbolic act that shifted her from child of the king to vessel of the divine essence. The eunuchs handled the logistics. They ensured the ceremonies were performed, that the priests blessed the chambers, that the silk sheets and perfumes matched the prescribed purity code. It was violation disguised as regulation, piety wrapped in paperwork. In the archives of Persepolis, fragments of this system still exist. tablets list rations of myrrh, saffron, and rosewater for preparation of royal offerings. Others record the distribution of robes, cosmetics, and jewelry for the daughters of His Majesty. Historians once believed these referred to temple rituals, but archaeological context revealed their true meaning. They were preparations for the nights when daughters became offerings to the throne. Xerxes understood the power of process. If horror can be ritualized, it becomes invisible. If it can be written into law, it becomes sacred. The empire did not hide his practices, it standardized them. Priests composed hymns about the joining of divine essences. Artists carved reliefs of winged figures touching mortal women, symbolizing the union of heaven and earth. Propaganda designed to sanctify power itself. Every image on the palace walls was a lesson. Obedience brings order. Submission sustains the world. Outside those walls, Persian justice appeared enlightened. Courts settled disputes between farmers and merchants. Inspectors audited taxes to prevent corruption. Royal edicts banned the killing of certain sacred animals and prescribed fair wages for laborers. The empire looked rational, lawful, advanced, a civilization of light. But the closer you came to the throne, the more that light turned blinding. Law, instead of restraining power, existed to glorify it. The king wasn't under the law. The king was the law. And once that idea takes root, everything becomes possible. A man can call conquest mercy. He can call silence virtue. He can call the rape of his own child a ritual of renewal. And his subjects, bound by faith and fear, will record it as duty. Among those subjects were the mothers. They lived between two contradictions, guardians and participants. They prepared their daughters, combed their hair, painted their faces, whispered comfort they did not believe. Some tried to protect them by teaching how to endure without resistance, how to let the mind leave the body until morning came on. Others clung to denial, pretending the summons would never arrive, but it always did. In the outer halls, eunuchs moved with precision, their faces carved of stone. They were both victims and enforcers, castrated to protect royal lineage, trusted to manage the logistics of violation. Each held a copy of the purity calendar, dictating which daughter, which night, which chamber. There was no rebellion because there was no language for it. What word could describe sin when the law itself declared it sacred? This was the genius and the horror of Xerxes' system. He didn't need executioners. He needed priests, scribes, and architects. Men who turned cruelty into paperwork and shame into stone. By their hands, the emperor's crimes became the empire's religion. Years later, Greek envoys visiting Persepolis would write about the overwhelming order of the court, how even silence seemed rehearsed, how every gesture mirrored devotion. They never saw the chambers beneath, where that order was born. They didn't hear the prayers whispered by girls who prayed not for salvation, but for numbness. To the world, Persia was law and light. To those within the harem, it was law as darkness, a legal code written in skin, blood, and obedience. This was how an empire justified the unthinkable, by giving sin a schedule, by giving pain a title, by convincing its people that obedience was the price of peace. And as long as the ledgers balanced, no one questioned what they truly recorded, because to question the law was to question the gods. and in Xerxes' world, the gods had already chosen their side. If the empire was a body, then the harem was its heart, beating quietly, unseen, but pumping obedience through every vein of Persian power. From the outside, it looked like paradise. Marble courtyards filled with fountains, silk curtains moving with the desert wind, laughter echoing faintly through the stone. But beneath the beauty was a system designed with precision, not for pleasure, but for control. The harem wasn't chaos, it was administration. Every woman, every servant, every corridor had purpose. The entrance was guarded by eunuchs, men cut from the chain of inheritance, trusted because they could never create rivals. They kept records, managed schedules, and enforced silence. The harem had its own hierarchy: chief wife, secondary wives, concubines, attendants, daughters, and slaves. Every rank carried different privileges and different duties to the king. But none of them, not even the queen, owned her body. In the empire of Xerxes, women were inventory, catalogued, perfumed, and replaced. To the outside world, these women were invisible. They had no legal name beyond property of the king. Even their voices were mediated by eunuchs, who relayed messages between chambers in coded phrases. Love letters, prayers, and requests for mercy were rewritten by officials before they reached the king's hand. In this way, even emotions were filtered, purified, processed through the bureaucracy of divinity. But the system didn't stop at the palace walls. The harem was also a political institution, a living factory for alliances. Each nobleman who wanted favor offered a daughter. Each general who won a war received one in return. The trade of women became the empire's hidden currency, a moral economy that ran parallel to silver and grain. And because the harem was officially sacred, its transactions could never be questioned. When a girl was brought into the harem, she entered a process more disciplined than any military training. First, she was stripped of her birth clothes and her name. She was bathed, her hair oiled, her skin examined. Scribes documented her origin, age, and condition, then sealed her record with the royal emblem, a lion devouring a bull, symbol of cosmic order. After that, she was dressed in linen and brought before the matrons, older women who trained her in behavior, posture, and silence. They taught her how to speak when spoken to, how to lower her eyes at the right moment, how to smile without emotion. In the language of the palace, this was called preparation. In reality, it was erasure. By the time Xerxes saw them, they were no longer individuals. They were forms of worship, physical proof of his divine status. And the eunuchs ensured that proof was always available. Each day they recorded which women had been summoned, which had pleased the king, which were pregnant, and which were to be retired. Retirement rarely meant freedom. Sometimes it meant transfer to a distant estate. Sometimes it meant disappearance. Even the architecture reflected control. The harem's corridors formed a labyrinth, curved passages leading to identical rooms, impossible to navigate without permission. Windows were narrow and high, letting in light but showing nothing of the world outside. Every door could be locked from the outside. Every whisper could be heard through hollow walls built specifically for surveillance. The space itself taught submission. Among the women, alliances formed quietly. A glance, a shared piece of fruit, a whispered prayer before sleep. But trust was dangerous. The eunuchs listened, and rumor was a weapon sharper than any blade. One accusation of disrespect to the divine order could erase a woman overnight. She wouldn't be executed. Executions were for men. She would simply vanish from the records, her name burned from the ledgers, her chamber reassigned. The empire erased people the way a scribe erased ink, efficiently, without trace. Yet, despite the control, small acts of humanity persisted. Some mothers secretly kept tally marks on the stone, counting the years their daughters had survived. Some women hid small clay figures under their mattresses, idols of old village gods long banned by royal decree. They prayed not for salvation, but for forgetfulness, that their daughters might never remember what they endured. Outside the harem, poets wrote hymns praising Xerxes' divine beauty. Sculptors carved him larger than life, arms outstretched, surrounded by winged angels. But inside, the same image appeared in miniature. The king's likeness embossed on the women's jewelry, stamped on the walls of their chambers, engraved even on the handles of the combs they used. It was not decoration, it was ownership, a reminder that even the tools of vanity belonged to him. To maintain the illusion of order, the priests visited regularly. They burned incense and recited verses that equated obedience with holiness. They told the women their suffering was sacred, that by serving the king they preserved cosmic balance. And so, religion became the anesthetic of despair. Each prayer replaced pain with duty. Each ritual replaced self with silence. By the time Xerxes entered the harem each night, the system had already done its work. He didn't see women. He saw symbols, extensions of divine right, bodies arranged by theology. He didn't need to shout or threaten. The architecture, the rituals, the laws, they had already subdued everything human before he even arrived. The harem was not his indulgence. It was his empire in miniature, a world that mirrored his rule outside the walls, beautiful, efficient, and utterly enslaved. It was proof that he could govern not just with armies or gold, but with faith and fear. And that machine, once perfected, could not be stopped, because it didn't need Xerxes to operate. It ran on belief. It ran on silence. And belief, unlike flesh, does not die easily. Before the king ever summoned his daughters, the empire had already done it for him. From the moment they could walk, the princesses of Persia were trained to embody divinity, not to think, not to feel, but to represent. Their bodies were symbols, their silence the language of power. They were the daughters of a god-king, and therefore never truly human. Education began at the age of 5. While boys studied warfare and governance, the girls learned posture, poise, and obedience. Their instructors were older women, widows of generals, priestesses, and those who had served in the harem before. Each lesson was wrapped in reverence: how to walk without noise, how to smile without emotion, how to weep without disturbing others. The first rule drilled into them was simple: a royal woman's body is not her own. To the court, this was refinement. To the girls, it was indoctrination. Each morning began with ritual washing, each night with recitation of hymns about the purity of royal blood. The priests taught that the king's touch was a blessing, that proximity to him made the unworthy pure. They heard it so often that belief became muscle memory. By adolescence, fear had been rebranded as devotion. The palace reinforced it through beauty. Every surface shone: gold ceilings, marble floors, mirrors of polished bronze. In a world without privacy, reflection became surveillance. Each girl saw herself multiplied endlessly, perfect posture, painted lips, lowered eyes, until she no longer knew where performance ended and person began. When a servant corrected her appearance, it wasn't vanity, it was worship. Every correction was a sermon, perfection was obedience, and obedience was survival. Their mothers watched quietly, powerless to intervene. Some were too broken to resist, others too fearful to draw attention. They whispered advice behind curtains. Never speak first. Never ask why. Sometimes the warnings were simpler. Forget what you remember. Because in the palace, memory was dangerous. It made girls question the rules. It made them human. And humanity had no place in the order of divine law. The eunuchs acted as instructors too. They taught the girls which gestures pleased the king, how to bow, how to laugh softly, how to look grateful even when afraid. They drilled them in music and dance, telling them that art was service, and service was holy. And the girls obeyed, because the eunuchs were both terrifying and pitiful, reminders of what happened to men who disobeyed the order of purity. At 13, each princess underwent a ceremony called the illumination. It was presented as a rite of passage, marking the transition from child to divine womanhood. But the ritual itself was preparation for subjugation. They were bathed in milk and honey, anointed with sacred oil, and dressed in white silk. Their foreheads were marked with gold dust, symbolizing light entering flesh. The high priest recited, "From the light of the king, life renews itself." That line was the empire's most brutal lie, because what came after renewal was ownership. After the ceremony, the girl's status changed. She was now listed in the royal ledgers under the section, Women under Divine Guardianship. From that day, her movements were restricted, her meals supervised, her correspondence intercepted. Even laughter required permission. She was no longer a daughter. She was property waiting for purpose. For some, that purpose was political marriage. For others, it was service within the sacred chambers. Everyone knew what that meant, though no one dared say it. The priests called it continuation of the flame. The eunuchs called it assignment. The women called it nothing at all, because naming it would make it real. Amydas, one of Xerxes' younger daughters, remembered her own illumination clearly. The smell of incense made her sick. The priest's hands were cold as he placed the gold on her brow. She saw her mother standing in the back, eyes hollow but dry. When the ceremony ended, the priest told her, "The king will call when the stars align." She didn't understand, not yet. But that night, her mother began to tremble without speaking, a silent collapse that told Amydas everything words never could. By the time the summons came weeks later, Amydas already knew resistance was impossible. Her training had prepared her for obedience, not understanding. Every instinct to flee collided with the years of lessons that taught her. Fear was blasphemy. She moved as the system had molded her to move, gracefully, silently, perfectly. The preparation was complete. Outside, the empire celebrated festivals of victory. Banners of gold and crimson hung from palace walls, proclaiming the divine glory of the king. Inside, a child walked down a marble corridor, surrounded by eunuchs who had memorized her every step. The same empire that taught her the meaning of holiness was now teaching her the meaning of property. And the man waiting for her, her father, her God, her king, believed he was fulfilling the will of heaven. The door closed behind her. Incense burned. The priests began their chants. From that moment, she was no longer a person. She was a proof. A living argument that power, once sanctified, could make even the unthinkable lawful. And outside those walls, no one spoke her name again. For years, Xerxes' palace functioned like a closed machine, every ritual precise, every emotion filtered through fear. But no system built on silence lasts forever. The first crack appeared not through rebellion, but through love. Her name was Artenta, one of Xerxes' elder daughters, 16 years old, beautiful, educated, and frighteningly intelligent. She had grown up watching her father's power like a storm, dazzling, unpredictable, and lethal. Unlike her sisters, Artenta asked questions. Why were the women never allowed to walk outside the palace gardens? Why did the priests speak of purity, but tremble when the king entered the harem? The eunuchs warned her that curiosity was dangerous, but curiosity was the one luxury she refused to surrender. It began innocently. A general named Macystes, Xerxes' brother-in-law, was often present in the royal court. He was a man of discipline, older than her father's daughters, but younger than Xerxes himself, a soldier who had served faithfully during the Greek campaign. During the evenings, when the king drank and the court musicians played, Macystes would speak to Artenta about philosophy and the stars. He told her stories of the empire's outer provinces, of the mountains beyond Sogdia, where the air smelled of pine, not incense. In a world built on obedience, his words were oxygen. The connection between them deepened. Some accounts say it was love, others call it curiosity. But whatever it was, it broke the single unspoken law of the Persian court. No one touches what belongs to the king. And in Xerxes' world, everything belonged to him, especially his daughters. When whispers reached him that Artenta had been seen speaking privately with Macystes, his rage was immediate and theological. He didn't see a young girl or a frightened man. He saw blasphemy, because in his mind, the relationship between father and daughter wasn't just family. It was divine property. To violate that was not merely disobedience. It was treason against the God within the king. The court froze. The priests prepared purification rites. The eunuchs waited for orders. But Xerxes' fury didn't fall where people expected. He did not kill Artenta. He punished Macystes' wife, his own sister. Her name was not recorded in the official ledgers. Perhaps the chroniclers couldn't bear to write it. Xerxes accused her of disloyalty for failing to control her husband's heart. He ordered her mutilation as spectacle and warning. Her ears, nose, tongue, and breasts were cut away in front of the women of the court. Her screams echoed through the marble halls as the priests recited prayers for purity. The message was clear. No woman in the empire was exempt. If a general's wife could be destroyed for her husband's desire, what chance did a daughter have? Xerxes' justice was not blind. It was performative. He turned cruelty into order, and order into proof of divine favor. In the empire's logic, a ruler's rage was just another form of holiness. Artenta disappeared soon after. The official records list her as relocated to secure quarters for re-education. But no document records her release, her death, or her burial. Some Greek sources, like Herodotus, wrote that she was executed. Others say she was married off to a distant noble. Her name changed, her history erased. The palace never spoke of her again, but her absence was louder than her presence. Something shifted after the scandal. The eunuchs noticed the king's growing paranoia. He ordered tighter surveillance of the harem, daily inspections of correspondence, random searches of chambers. The priests introduced new prayers, emphasizing loyalty of thought as well as body. Servants were forbidden to look directly at the royal daughters. The air itself grew heavy with caution. Yet, even in silence, the women remembered. They whispered Artainta's name like a ghost's, never aloud, always at night. For them, she became more than a lost sister. She was evidence that the king's divinity could be wounded, that even a god could bleed pride. Her story traveled in secret, through servants, through lullabies, through coded embroidery in robes. The pattern of the broken lotus, a flower missing one petal, became their hidden language of mourning. Outside the palace, the empire continued to praise Xerxes. Scribes wrote hymns comparing him to the sun. Courtiers told stories of his mercy and wisdom. But within the harem, every whisper, every footstep, every shift of fabric carried the same quiet terror. If he could destroy his sister for another man's mistake, what would he do to his daughters if they failed to worship correctly? The scandal of Artainta did more than terrify. It exposed the truth behind the ritual. The harem wasn't sacred, it was strategic. Its purity wasn't about divinity, it was about control. The priests could chant all they wanted, but behind every word of prayer was fear of the king's will. And that fear would only grow stronger, spreading through the palace like smoke. Because when a ruler begins to mistake obedience for holiness, every act of violence becomes a sermon. And Xerxes was just getting started. In 480 BCE, Xerxes prepared to march on Greece, the war his father had failed to win. It would be the largest invasion the ancient world had ever seen, an army drawn from 40 nations, stretching from Egypt to India. He called it vengeance. The priests called it destiny. But behind the language of glory was something colder. Xerxes needed to prove that the gods still favored him. He had conquered his family. Now he would conquer the world. For 4 years, Persia became a factory of war. Every province sent men, gold, and grain to the capital. Bridges were built across the Hellespont. Canals were dug through mountains. But one detail went unnoticed by historians for centuries. Among the thousands of carts following the army, several were covered in silk and guarded by eunuchs. Inside them were women of the royal harem, and among them Xerxes' daughters. The official explanation was ceremonial. The king's divine essence could not be separated from his body, and the women who carried that essence, his wives, concubines, and daughters, had to accompany him as vessels of purity. In reality, they were hostages of loyalty. The harem was the heart of his authority. By bringing it with him, Xerxes brought his control. No general could rebel while his wife or daughter traveled in the same caravan. No noble could plot while the king possessed the bloodlines of every family at court. The Greek historians wrote of the invasion's scale in awe. 1 million men, 1,000 ships, 20 nations under one banner. They did not see the smaller, quieter procession behind, the veiled carriages, the eunuchs with ledgers, the priests burning incense before the king's tent at dusk. Those rituals were not for the gods of war. They were for the god of purity, the god of Xerxes himself. Each night, before the king met his generals, the high priest performed a ceremony of renewal. He would bless a chosen woman, sometimes a concubine, sometimes a daughter, and send her into the royal tent. The scriptures said this ensured the king's divine fire stayed unquenched in foreign lands. But for the women, it was another night of sacred captivity. The campaign marched on blood and silence. Xerxes didn't only use his daughters as symbols of faith, he used them as currency. When a general distinguished himself in battle, Xerxes rewarded him with a marriage alliance, often to one of his own daughters. It was the highest honor a man could receive, and the most devastating fate a princess could endure. Because in this empire, marriage was not a union, it was a command. Greek records name one such man, Megabyzus, a general from a noble Persian family who led troops at the Hellespont. After a decisive victory in Thrace, Xerxes summoned him to his tent. There, before the assembled priests, he offered him a bride, Princess Amidas, perhaps 14 years old. The ceremony was held not in a temple, but on the battlefield itself. A silk pavilion was raised, incense and gold dust filled the air. The king placed his hand on Megabyzus' shoulder and declared, "You now hold what I have made holy." The soldiers cheered, the priests sang, and Amida stood motionless, staring at the sand beneath her feet, understanding that this was her escape from her father, but not from her fate. Marriage, in Xerxes' world, was another campaign, a way to bind men's ambition to his will. Once a general became the king's son-in-law, he was trapped. His blood, his children, his lineage, all were now branches of the royal tree. To betray Xerxes would be to destroy his own family. It was a masterstroke of political control disguised as honor. The logistics of the war mirrored the logic of the harem. Everything had order, hierarchy, and ritual. Supplies moved like prayers: grain, wine, oil, perfume, each accounted for by scribes who viewed soldiers and concubines alike as entries in the same ledger. The priests blessed the bridges before the army crossed, sprinkling blood over the wooden planks. They said it was to appease the gods of the sea. But among the harem, the women whispered that the blood came from them. The priests had cut their arms, calling it sacred contribution. Pain became an offering. Suffering became proof of faith. Xerxes' campaign was not just military, it was metaphysical. He wanted to conquer Greece the way he had conquered his own household, through ritual, through domination, through fear disguised as holiness. When his ship set fire to Athens, he ordered the ashes collected and mixed into paint for a mural he planned to build in Persepolis. A mural showing the King of Kings standing over the ruins of the West. That mural was never finished. But the idea behind it, the vision of glory through destruction, survived long after his army fell. As the invasion dragged on, whispers began to spread among the soldiers. They spoke of the golden wagons that followed the king. They said the women inside never saw the sun. Some swore they heard cries at night, muffled by the sound of drums. A few even claimed that after certain defeats, new names appeared in the harem's ledgers, foreign girls taken as tribute, added to the king's collection. In Xerxes' mind, the war was not failing. Every death was an offering, every conquest a ritual. He had turned empire itself into a religion, and religion into administration. He no longer saw a difference between ruling a nation and owning a body. Both were acts of divine possession. But no god remains unchallenged forever. When the tides turned, when the Greek fleet cornered his navy at Salamis and burned it before his eyes, Xerxes witnessed something the rituals could not protect him from: defeat. The gods he had invoked fell silent. The hymns no longer sounded holy, and for the first time, the King of Kings saw his power reflected not in gold, but in fire and loss. He returned to Persia humiliated, his divine image fractured. And when the world outside refused to worship him, he turned to the only world that still could: the harem. Because when an empire loses its enemies, it turns inward. And for Xerxes, home would become the new battlefield. When Xerxes returned to Persia, the empire greeted him with trumpets, incense, and lies. The priests proclaimed victory. The scribes carved triumphs that never happened. But the man beneath the crown was not the same king who had left for Greece. Something inside him had cracked, not from pity, but from failure. For a ruler who believed himself divine, defeat was not just humiliation, it was blasphemy. The great army that had once stretched from horizon to horizon returned in fragments. The bridges across the Hellespont were torn apart by storms. The ships burned in the harbors of Salamis. Tens of thousands of soldiers never made it home, their bones scattered across foreign shores. Xerxes had tried to erase Greece from the map. Instead, the gods had erased his invincibility. He arrived in Persepolis not as a conqueror, but as a man trying to convince his empire, and himself, that he still ruled by divine right. The court pretended to believe it. New festivals were created to celebrate the king's safe return. Priests burned offerings and sang hymns of loyalty, but beneath the gold and incense, everyone felt the tension. The empire's perfection was a mask, and it was cracking. The first to feel that fracture were the women. Xerxes' anger, too dangerous to aim outward, turned inward, toward the only realm he could still dominate absolutely. He began summoning the harem more often. Every night became ceremony. Every ceremony became punishment. Servants said he would sit for hours in silence before entering the women's quarters, staring at the flames of the oil lamps, whispering prayers to Ahura Mazda. When he finally rose, it was as if he believed the god had spoken. He would walk through the corridors barefoot, carrying a bowl of sacred oil, anointing the doors one by one. Each door led to a woman who could not refuse him. His daughters were no longer daughters. They were instruments of purification, tokens in a private war between the king and the gods he felt had betrayed him. The priests encouraged it. They told him his failures in Greece were the work of impurity, that the divine blood had been weakened by doubt and disobedience. To restore balance, he must reaffirm his holiness through the renewal of the bloodline. So Xerxes did what only absolute power can do. He turned sin into sacrament. Witnesses described a palace darker than any temple. The eunuchs moved through the corridors like shadows, bringing wine and silence. No one spoke of the screams. They were called songs of devotion. When a woman disappeared, it was said she had been taken into the light. Language itself became an accomplice, rephrasing horror into holiness. Some of the daughters had already been given away as political offerings. Those who remained lived in quiet terror, never knowing which night their turn would come. Each morning, the matrons checked their faces for signs of exhaustion or defiance. Neither was allowed. The king wanted beauty, but beauty without will. Perfection that did not speak. One of his daughters, a mistress, only 12 when her turn came, tried to pray before she was led to his chamber. Her mother whispered, "Be still, the gods will protect you." But in Persepolis, the gods had already chosen their side. That night marked the beginning of a cruelty that would make even the priests tremble. The stories that survive from this period are fragmented. Scribes were forbidden to record anything that might dishonor the divine image. But the fragments align: mutilations, burnings, punishments disguised as rituals. Xerxes began experimenting with what he called tests of purity, ordering acts so grotesque that even his attendants wept in secret. The same hands that built the aqueducts and temples now built instruments of pleasure and pain. The empire that had once measured progress in roads and art now measured devotion in suffering. Outside, Persepolis continued to gleam. Taxes were collected, roads repaired, ambassadors received. But inside the palace walls, something monstrous had become ordinary. A civilization that had ruled through reason and law now ruled through fear and silence. Every ritual was an echo of Xerxes' descent, a man trying to cleanse himself by drowning others. In the carved reliefs of the Apadana, Xerxes still appeared calm and eternal, standing tall above rows of supplicants. But archaeologists have found something those carvings never showed. Beneath the ceremonial halls, a network of narrow chambers, windowless and cold, built during the later years of his reign. No record explains their purpose, but traces of perfume, bone fragments, and bronze jewelry tell their own story. These were not storage rooms, they were containment. Defeat had driven Xerxes into madness, but it was not random. It was systematic, almost ritualistic, an attempt to rebuild his broken divinity through control. And like every empire built on fear, the more it trembled, the more it tightened its grip. By the time the decade ended, the King of Kings no longer ruled an empire, he ruled a shrine to himself, to power, to pain. Each act of violence against his daughters was not only revenge on the gods who failed him, it was proof that he still could. Because for Xerxes, cruelty had become the only prayer that still worked. By the later years of his reign, Xerxes no longer needed to justify his actions. He had become the justification itself, the living law, the body through which the divine spoke. And when law becomes flesh, every act of power starts to look like reason. The priests called this new doctrine the covenant of blood. They declared that the king's seed was the vessel of cosmic order, that even his most private acts had political meaning. To question them was to question the universe. That doctrine would soon destroy another daughter. Her name was Amestris, though Persian records list several women with that name. This one was 12, small, quiet, still caught between childhood and the expectations of the divine court. Her father had noticed her early. To him, she was not a child, but an opportunity, a political instrument wrapped in sacred flesh. At the time, one man stood closest to the king's power, Artabanus, commander of the royal guard. He controlled the soldiers who protected Xerxes' chamber and held the authority to decide who could approach the throne. For years, Xerxes trusted him, but trust in Persepolis was fragile. The king had seen how generals and governors could turn ambition into treason. To rule such men, he needed not loyalty, but debt. And so, Xerxes designed a trap only a god king could conceive. He would bind Artabanus not through gold, but through shame. First, he summoned a mistress. For weeks, priests performed rites of purification. She was bathed in milk, fed honey and wine, and kept in isolation within the chamber of illumination. When the preparations ended, she was brought before her father. The ceremony was private, but its intention public, to ensure the royal bloodline renewed itself. Xerxes called it union. The court called it holy. But, in truth, it was violation recited as ritual. Afterward, when Amestris's belly began to swell, the king announced a marriage, not to a prince, not to a noble son, but to Artabanus himself. The commander was stunned. He could not refuse. Refusal would mean blasphemy, rebellion against divine order. So, he accepted, knowing that the bride he would take into his house carried a child that was not his, a child that was both the king's son and his wife's half-brother. The wedding was held in the Hall of Columns, beneath frescoes showing the god Ahura Mazda blessing the king's reign. The guests bowed, the priests chanted. None spoke of the truth. How could they? The empire had no language for horror that came from holiness. Artabanus married Amestris under the shadow of that silence. The priests proclaimed it a union of loyalty and divine will. Xerxes declared it proof that his blood sanctified all who carried it. The courtiers cheered, and the empire applauded. A ceremony had erased a crime. But for Artabanus, the marriage was poison. Every time he saw the child, he saw his humiliation. Every time he looked at his young wife, he saw a reminder that the king owned not only his obedience, but his manhood. Xerxes had turned the most intimate human bonds, husband and wife, father and daughter, into instruments of political control. It was not madness, it was method. Through Amestris, Xerxes achieved the perfect chain of power. Her husband commanded the royal guard, but his household was now an extension of the throne. His heir, raised under his roof, would carry the king's blood. If Artabanus rebelled, Xerxes could expose the truth, ruining him and his line forever. If he remained loyal, he would live in submission to a secret he could never speak. The king had found a way to make obedience permanent. And Amestris? Her life became a performance of survival. She lived between two prisons, the memory of her father's chamber and the home of a husband who could never love her without remembering who she had been given by. Her pregnancy advanced under constant supervision. Midwives whispered prayers to ward off evil spirits. What they meant were the living ones. When her son was born, the priests declared him blessed, a child of divine purity, destined for greatness. No one dared mention whose blood ran in his veins. Years later, fragments of letters from the palace archives mention Artabanus's household. They describe tensions between the commander and the king, whispers of resentment that grew like mold beneath gilded ceilings. Xerxes, suspicious as ever, ordered spies to monitor him. They reported that Artabanus often avoided the palace, spending nights outside the city, claiming illness. Some said he could no longer stand to breathe the same air as the king. Others said he had begun to plot. The truth came slowly, like rot in the foundation of an empire. Xerxes had built his power on humiliation, and humiliation is never forgotten. In trying to make Artabanus his slave, he had made him his assassin. Years later, the man he bound through marriage would become the instrument of his death. But that would come later. For now, the harem celebrated another ceremony, another holy union, another girl stepping into silence. The priests called it duty, the courtiers called it honor. And outside, the empire bowed before its god, not realizing that the throne they worshipped had already begun to crack. Because power that feeds on its own blood does not live forever. It began in whispers, untraceable, cautious, born from fear. After years of silence, people within the palace started to murmur that the King of Kings had lost his divine favor. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The empire that once stretched from Egypt to India now trembled under the weight of its own fear. The bridges Xerxes had built, to nations, to gods, to his own bloodline, had turned to chains. Artabanus, the commander bound to him by crime, had become the most dangerous man in Persia. He knew too much. He carried secrets no one else dared think. And worse, he had nothing left to fear. By 465 BCE, Xerxes had grown paranoid beyond reason. He stopped trusting his generals, dismissed his advisors, and surrounded himself with priests and eunuchs. His daughters rarely saw him except during ritual gatherings, where he appeared wearing gold robes and jeweled armor, claiming to speak the will of Ahura Mazda. But the empire saw what he refused to. The God King was now just a man haunted by ghosts. Artabanus watched him unravel. He remembered every humiliation, the forced marriage, the child not his own, the years of serving a master who treated loyalty like weakness. And as Xerxes withdrew deeper into the harem, Artabanus began to plan. He understood the king's habits, his guards' rotations, the rituals of wine and solitude that marked each night. The plot would not come from ambition, but from exhaustion. A man pushed too far eventually stops kneeling. One summer night, as Persepolis slept under a canopy of stars, Artabanus entered the palace. He carried no sword, only a dagger thin enough to hide in his sleeve. The corridors were silent except for the low hum of the priest's evening chants. He passed through the golden doors of the king's chamber, guarded by men he had trained. They didn't stop him. They bowed. Inside, Xerxes was alone, reclining on silk cushions, surrounded by lamps and half-burned incense. The king barely looked up. He trusted Artabanus more than any living soul. Perhaps he believed no mortal could touch the divine. History records the moment simply. The king was slain in his bed by one who guarded him. But that sterile phrase hides the truth. It was not a political act. It was a ritual of vengeance. When the blade sank into his chest, Xerxes tried to speak, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. but only blood came out. For a man who had silenced so many, death arrived without ceremony. By dawn, the empire had no master, and that was when the true violence began. The sons of Xerxes, Darius, Hystaspes, and Artaxerxes, awoke to chaos. Each believed he had the strongest claim to the throne. Each believed the others had conspired with Artabanus. The harem erupted in panic. Eunuchs fled with ledgers and jewelry. Servants burned records to erase their names. And the daughters, the ones who had survived the king's hand, became the first sacrifices of the new power struggle. Artabanus, ever the strategist, tried to seize control. He claimed he had killed Xerxes to protect the throne, not to steal it. He positioned himself as regent, placing young Artaxerxes, barely 20, on the throne as a puppet. But power that is stolen can never be controlled. Within weeks, Artaxerxes discovered the truth, that the man who stood beside him had murdered his father. And like his father before him, Artaxerxes learned that power demands blood. Artabanus was executed in the same chamber where Xerxes had died. His body was burned, his ashes scattered into the wind. But the vengeance did not end there. The new king turned his wrath inward, toward his own family, toward his sisters. He had inherited not just an empire, but a theology of control. To secure his rule, he did exactly what Xerxes had taught: destroy those closest to you. The daughters of Xerxes, now women in their 20s and 30s, were accused of conspiracy. Some had husbands who commanded armies. Others had sons with potential claims to power. Artaxerxes ordered purges, executions disguised as justice, exiles disguised as mercy. Women were taken from their homes, stripped of titles, sent to remote provinces. Those who resisted were quietly killed, their names removed from the ledgers. The harem became a graveyard of memory. Among the dead was Amytas, the daughter who had first been taken to her father's chamber years before. She had lived through every transformation of the palace, from temple to prison to slaughterhouse. After Xerxes' death, she had tried to form alliances among surviving royal women, writing secret letters, passing messages through servants. But in a world where silence had been law for decades, even communication became rebellion. When her letters were intercepted, she was declared spiritually diseased. The priests said her grief was contagious. Her children were taken, her attendants executed. She died soon after, officially of illness, unofficially of despair. In a single generation, the royal family had devoured itself. The same logic that once justified incest now justified murder. The same priests who had blessed the king's divine unions now blessed his son's purges. The empire that had worshipped purity ended up choking on its own corruption. Outside the palace, Persia still glittered. The roads still carried merchants. The temples still burned incense. But everyone knew the truth, whispered behind doors. The gods were silent, the bloodline cursed, the King of Kings no longer sacred. Because when a man builds his power on blood, he leaves no heirs, only stains. In the decades after Xerxes' death, the empire changed its face, but not its soul. The marble walls of Persepolis still gleamed in the desert sun. The court still bowed before a throne carved with lions. But behind the chants, the incense and the ceremony, the royal women lived as ghosts in their own history. The harem no longer belonged to Xerxes, yet his spirit haunted every corridor. Artaxerxes, his son and heir, rebuilt the chambers, renamed the halls, and replaced the old eunuchs with younger, loyal ones. He claimed this was purification, a cleansing of the corruption of his father's era. But what he called purification was only repetition. The system survived because it no longer needed a tyrant. It had become its own god. Among the survivors was Amitas, or what remained of her name. In the official records, she was Lady of the Quiet House. No title, no lineage, no mention of being the daughter of Xerxes. Her children, raised inside the palace under new names, had been taught that their mother had died in disgrace. But fragments of letters, found centuries later in clay jars, show she had continued to write, small scraps of defiance written in the only ink she had left, memory. "They took my name," one fragment reads, "but not my knowing. They say the king's will is divine, but I have seen the gods bleed." Those lines, simple, almost whisper-like, are among the earliest pieces of feminist literature in recorded history. Amitas and several other royal women began forming hidden alliances, using servants and healers as messengers. They could not fight openly, but they could preserve truth. They collected small items, rings, combs, scraps of fabric embroidered with initials, and buried them beneath the floors of the women's quarters. Each object was a confession, proof that they had existed, that the palace had not silenced everyone. Even in captivity, they developed systems of coded resistance. A red thread woven into a veil meant safe to speak. A silver pin turned upside down meant someone has been taken. At night, they sang lullabies to their daughters, songs that seemed innocent but carried warnings inside the rhymes. To the priests, they were lullabies. To the women, they were rebellion disguised as devotion. One account from later Greek sources describes a woman known only as the seamstress of shadows. She was said to have been a former concubine of Xerxes, who survived into Artaxerxes' reign, using her position as royal tailor to smuggle messages between imprisoned noblewomen. Each garment she stitched contained hidden patterns, threads woven into geometric designs that carried secret meanings. Her embroidery was considered so beautiful that it was placed in the royal treasury. No one knew that it contained a record of crimes. For decades, these small acts of resistance accumulated beneath the surface of ritual. While men wrote laws and priests wrote scripture, women wrote memory, coded, fragile, but enduring. It was their way of reclaiming something sacred, truth. Artaxerxes tried to erase his father's legacy. He banned depictions of Xerxes in new temples and ordered old inscriptions altered to replace the name Xerxes with the king. But the women remembered. Their memories spread quietly through generations of servants, healers, and midwives who carried the stories into ordinary homes. By the time of Darius II, those whispers had become parables, lessons told to young girls in kitchens and courtyards. Do not trust the man who calls his power holy. Even the gods can lie. This oral memory outlived the dynasty itself. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia a century later and entered the ruins of Persepolis, Greek historians recorded stories told by local women about a king who used his daughters to please the gods. To the conquerors, it sounded like legend. To the Persians, it was inheritance. Archaeologists later found evidence that the women's network had left physical marks of defiance, hidden carvings on the underside of marble benches in the women's quarters. Simple symbols, circles within circles, sometimes enclosing a dot. Zoroastrian priests identified them as the eye that remembers. Modern scholars believe they were made by the surviving daughters or their attendants. Each circle a vow that the truth would not vanish. Their resistance was not dramatic. There were no uprisings, no assassinations, no manifestos, just endurance, quiet, deliberate, and defiant. They could not stop the empire, but they could refuse to disappear. And that refusal was a form of victory. The irony of Xerxes' legacy is that the very system he built to control women became the medium through which they recorded his crimes. His harem, meant to erase identity, became an archive of pain. His rituals of purity, meant to sanctify power, became the language of accusation. The king had ruled through silence, but it was silence that ultimately betrayed him, because silence remembers. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the Persian court had changed rulers several times, but one law endured. No king ever again dared claim divine right to his daughters. The priests no longer preached about the sacred blood. They had learned the cost of worshipping men as gods. Still, the price had been unimaginable. Generations of women broken to preserve an illusion of order. But their fragments, rings, carvings, whispers, remained. They are what modern archaeologists find today, what historians read between the lines of royal decrees. They are what transform myth back into memory. In the end, the empire that had tried to immortalize itself in stone was remembered not for its victories, but for its victims. And it is their memory, the quiet, persistent memory of the women, that outlived every king. Because sometimes, history's loudest voice is the one that refused to speak. Today, Persepolis stands silent. Columns rise against a blue sky, their tops carved with lions and bulls, locked in eternal struggle. Tourists walk the same polished stones where kings once marched, snapping photos, admiring symmetry, marveling at civilization. They do not see what is missing. They see empire, not consequence. Beneath those stones, archaeologists have found what the royal chronicles never mentioned. Women's jewelry crushed under collapsed roofs, children's bangles buried beside broken oil lamps, ivory combs with inscriptions too faint to read. No bodies remain, only fragments, small, unassuming, but undeniable. They are not relics of glory. They are evidence. Among the ruins of the women's quarters, one inscription was discovered carved into the back of a marble panel. It was invisible to anyone who stood in the room. Someone had written it for the wall itself. The king said, "We are his blood, but we bleed alone." 6 words, the only surviving voice of a woman from Xerxes' harem. 6 words that unravel centuries of ritual, law, and divinity, because they expose the system for what it was. Not holiness, not destiny, but ownership disguised as faith. For centuries, Persian historians wrote of Xerxes as a god of order, a builder of palaces, a patron of art. And all of that was true. But behind every empire of marble stands a ledger written in flesh. Xerxes' empire measured its greatness by how completely it could control. And control, once perfected, always turns inward. The harem was not an accident of lust. It was the blueprint of empire itself, the belief that possession is purity and obedience is love. The bones of the women tell another story. Forensic analysis shows signs of malnutrition, deformities from confinement, injuries consistent with repeated restraint. They were the wives and daughters of gods, but they died like prisoners. In their silence, the empire found its order. In their suffering, it found its faith. When archaeologists uncovered a section of burned tiles near the women's baths, they found traces of pigment, red and gold mixed together. Under a microscope, the gold was from ceremonial paint. The red was human blood. The pigments had fused, hardened by fire, two elements the empire could no longer separate. That mixture, unintentional yet perfect, became the truest symbol of Xerxes' reign, beauty fused with violence, sanctity welded to cruelty. Modern scholars debate how to interpret these ruins. Some insist on cultural relativism, that the ancient world obeyed different laws, that we cannot impose modern morality on ancient power. But bones do not care for philosophy. They testify. They are the most honest historians. When you walk through Persepolis today, you can still trace the path from the Apadana, the grand audience hall, to the smaller, secluded quarters of the harem. The air changes there. Sound softens. The wind seems to hold its breath. You realize the empire's greatest secret, that its beauty was not despite its brutality, but because of it. That order was built on the breaking of bodies. That silence was a policy, not an accident. The big question, the one that began this story, finds its answer here. What happens when a civilization confuses holiness with ownership? It builds wonders that endure for millennia, and fills them with ghosts that never leave. The Roman poet Juvenal once wrote that absolute power corrupts even the prayers of men. But Xerxes went further. He corrupted the prayers of women, made worship a wound, turned divine love into statecraft. His empire endured for another century, but its soul was already gone. When Alexander burned Persepolis in 330 BCE, he thought he was destroying a rival. He was only finishing what Xerxes had begun. Yet even in destruction, something survived, something that no empire could silence. Those women who carved circles into the stone, who hid tokens beneath the floor, who taught their daughters the forbidden songs. They preserved more truth than all the kings combined. Because history does not belong to the victors. It belongs to whoever remembers. And the bones remembered. They remembered the gold dust and the cries. They remembered the scent of oil lamps and the cold hands of priests. They remembered the king who thought himself divine, and the daughters who paid the price for that illusion. Their silence became their monument. Their endurance became their revenge. So, when you stand before the ruins of Persepolis, know this. Every column, every carving, every stone still carries the weight of their names. They are not gone. They are the quiet architecture of truth, invisible, but unyielding. Because when the ledgers close, and the chronicles fall silent, and the temples turn to dust, only one thing remains. Not power, not glory, not God. Memory. And in that memory, the bones still speak, completed.